Section 8 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 3. Section 8. The History of Codadad and his Brothers. Those who have written the history of Diyarbakir inform us that there formerly reigned in the city of Haran a most magnificent and potent sultan, who loved his subjects and was equally beloved by them. He was endued with all virtues, and wanted nothing to complete his happiness but an heir. Though he had the finest women in the world in his seraglio, yet he was destitute of children. He continually prayed to heaven for them, and one night, in his sleep, a comely person, or rather a prophet, appeared to him, and said, "Your prayers are heard. You have obtained what you have desired. Rise as soon as you awake, go to your prayers, and make 2 genuflections. Then walk into the garden of your palace, call your gardener, and bid him bring you a pomegranate. Eat as many of the seeds as you please, and your wishes shall be accomplished." The sultan, calling to mind his dream when he awoke, returned thanks to heaven, got up, prayed, made 2 genuflections, and then went into his garden, where he took 50 pomegranate seeds, which he counted, and ate. He had 50 wives who shared his bed. They all proved with child. But there was one called Peruzj, who did not appear to be pregnant. He took an aversion to this lady, and would have her put to death. "Her barrenness," said he, "is a certain token that heaven does not judge Peruzj worthy to bear a prince. It is my duty to deliver the world from an object that is odious to the Lord." He would have executed his cruel purpose, had not his vizier prevented him, representing to him that all women were not of the same constitution, and that it was not impossible but that Peruzj might be with child, though it did not yet appear. "Well," answered the sultan, "let her live, but let her depart my court, for I cannot endure her." "Your majesty," replied the vizier, "may send her to Sultan Samer, your cousin." The sultan approved of this advice. He sent Peruzj to Samaria, with a letter in which he ordered his cousin to treat her well, and in case she proved with child, to give him notice of her being brought to bed. No sooner was Peruzj arrived in that country, than it appeared that she was pregnant, and at length she was delivered of a most beautiful prince. The prince of Samaria wrote immediately to the sultan of Haran, to acquaint him with the birth of a son, and to congratulate him on the occasion. The sultan was much rejoiced at this intelligence, and answered Prince Samer as follows: "Cousin, all my other wives have each been delivered of a prince. I desire you to educate that of Peruzj, to give him the name of Codadad, and to send him to me when I may apply for him." The prince of Samaria spared nothing that might improve the education of his nephew. He taught him to ride, draw the bow, and all other accomplishments becoming the son of a sovereign, so that Codadad, at 18 years of age, was looked upon as a prodigy. The young prince, being inspired with a courage worthy of his birth, said one day to his mother, "Madam, I begin to grow weary of Samaria. I feel a passion for glory. Give me leave to seek it amidst the perils of war. My father, the sultan of Haran, has many enemies. Why does he not call me to his assistance? Why does he leave me here so long in obscurity? Must I spend my life in sloth, when all my brothers have the happiness to be fighting by his side?" "My son," answered Peruzj, "I am no less impatient to have your name become famous. I could wish you had already signalized yourself against your father's enemies, but we must wait till he requires it." "No, madam," replied Codadad, "I have already waited but too long. I burn to see the sultan, and am tempted to offer him my service as a young stranger. No doubt but he will accept of it, and I will not discover myself till I have performed some glorious actions. I desire to merit his esteem before he knows who I am." Peruzj approved of his generous resolutions, and Codadad departed from Samaria, as if he had been going to the chase, without acquainting Prince Samer lest he should thwart his design. He was mounted on a white charger, who had a bit and shoes of gold. His housing was of blue satin embroidered with pearls. The hilt of his scimitar was of one single diamond, and the scabbard of sandalwood, adorned with emeralds and rubies, and on his shoulder he carried his bow and quiver. In this equipage, which greatly set off his handsome person, he arrived at the city of Harran, and soon found means to offer his service to the sultan, who, being charmed with his beauty and promising appearance, and perhaps indeed by natural sympathy, gave him a favourable reception, and asked his name and quality. "Sir," answered Codadad, "I am son to an emir of Grand Cairo. An inclination to travel has made me quit my country, and understanding, in my passage through your dominions, that you were engaged in war, I am come to your court to offer your majesty my service." The sultan showed him extraordinary kindness, and gave him a command in his army. The young prince soon signalized his bravery. He gained the esteem of the officers, and was admired by the soldiers. Having no less wit than courage, he so far advanced himself in the sultan's esteem as to become his favourite. All the ministers and other courtiers daily resorted to Codadad, and were so eager to purchase his friendship, that they neglected the sultan's sons. The princes could not but resent this conduct, and imputing it to the stranger, all conceived an implacable hatred against him. But the sultan's affection daily increasing, he was never weary of giving him fresh testimonies of his regard. He always would have him near his person, admired his conversation, ever full of wit and discretion, and to show his high opinion of his wisdom and prudence, committed to his care the other princes, though he was of the same age as they, so that Codadad was made governor of his brothers. This only served to heighten their hatred. "Is it come to this," said they, "that the sultan, not satisfied with loving a stranger more than us, will have him to be our governor, and not allow us to act without his leave? This is not to be endured. We must rid ourselves of this foreigner." "Let us go together," said one of them, "and dispatch him." "No, no," answered another, "we had better be cautious how we sacrifice ourselves. His death would render us odious to the sultan, who in return would declare us all unworthy to reign. Let us destroy him by some stratagem. We will ask his permission to hunt, and when at a distance from the palace, proceed to some other city, and stay there some time. The sultan will wonder at our absence, and perceiving we do not return, perhaps put the stranger to death, or at least will banish him from court for suffering us to leave the palace." All the princes applauded this artifice. They went together to Codadad, and desired him to allow them to take the diversion of hunting, promising to return the same day. Pirouzč's son was taken in the snare, and granted the permission his brothers desired. They set out, but never returned. They had been 3 days absent, when the sultan asked Codadad where the princes were, for it was long since he had seen them. "Sir," answered Codadad, after making a profound reverence, "they have been hunting these 3 days, but they promised me they would return sooner." The sultan grew uneasy, and his uneasiness increased when he perceived the princes did not return the next day. He could not check his anger. "Indiscreet stranger," said he to Codadad, "why did you let my sons go without bearing them company? Is it thus you discharge the trust I have reposed in you? Go, seek them immediately, and bring them to me, or your life shall be forfeited." These words chilled with alarm Pirouzč's unfortunate son. He armed himself, departed from the city, and like a shepherd who had lost his flock, searched the country for his brothers, inquiring at every village whether they had been seen, but hearing no news of them, abandoned himself to the most lively grief. "Alas, my brothers," said he, "what is become of you? Are you fallen into the hands of our enemies? Am I come to the court of Harran to be the occasion of giving the sultan so much anxiety?" He was inconsolable for having given the princes permission to hunt, or for not having borne them company. After some days spent in fruitless search, he came to a plain of prodigious extent, in the midst whereof was a palace built of black marble. He drew near, and at one of the windows beheld a most beautiful lady, but set off with no other ornament than her own charms, for her hair was dishevelled, her garments torn, and on her countenance appeared all the marks of the greatest affliction. As soon as she saw Codadad, and judged he might hear her, she directed her discourse to him, saying, "Young man, depart from this fatal place, or you will soon fall into the hands of the monster that inhabits it. A black, who feeds only on human blood, resides in this palace. He seizes all persons whom their ill fate conducts to this plain, and shuts them up in his dark dungeons, whence they are never released, but to be devoured by him." "Madam," answered Codadad, "tell me who you are, and be not concerned for myself." "I am a young woman of quality of Grand Cairo," replied the lady. "I was passing by this castle yesterday in my way to Baghdad, and met with the black, who killed all my attendants and brought me hither. I wish I had nothing but death to fear, but to add to my calamity, this monster would persuade me to love him, and in case I do not yield tomorrow to his brutality, I must expect the last violence. Once more," added she, "make your escape. The black will soon return. He is gone out to pursue some travellers he espied at a distance on the plain. Lose no time. I know not whether you can escape him by a speedy flight." She had scarcely done speaking before the black appeared. He was of monstrous bulk, and of a dreadful aspect, mounted on a large Tartar horse, and bore such a heavy scimitar that none but himself could wield. The prince, seeing him, was amazed at his gigantic stature, directed his prayers to heaven to assist him, then drew his scimitar, and firmly awaited his approach. The monster, despising so inconsiderable an enemy, called to him to submit without fighting. Codadad by his conduct showed that he was resolved to defend his life, for rushing upon him, he wounded him on the knee. The black, feeling himself wounded, uttered such a dreadful yell as made all the plain resound. He grew furious and foamed with rage, and raising himself on his stirrups, made at Codadad with his dreadful scimitar. The blow was so violent that it would have put an end to the young prince, had not he avoided it by a sudden spring. The scimitar made a horrible hissing in the air, but before the black could have time to make a second blow, Codadad struck him on his right arm with such force that he cut it off. The dreadful scimitar fell with the hand that held it, and the black, yielding under the violence of the stroke, lost his stirrups, and made the earth shake with the weight of his fall. The prince alighted at the same time, and cut off his enemy's head. Just then, the lady, who had been a spectator of the combat, and was still offering up her earnest prayers to heaven for the young hero, whom she admired, uttered a shriek of joy, and said to Codadad, "Prince, for the dangerous victory you have obtained, as well as your noble air, convinces me that you are of no common rank. Finish the work you have begun. The black has the keys of this castle. Take them and deliver me out of prison." The prince searched the wretch as he lay stretched on the ground, and found several keys. He opened the first door and entered a court, where he saw the lady coming to meet him. She would have cast herself at his feet, the better to express her gratitude, but he would not permit her. She commended his valour, and extolled him above all the heroes in the world. He returned her compliments, and she appeared still more lovely to him near than she had done at a distance. I know not whether she felt more joy at being delivered from the desperate danger she had been in, than he for having done so considerable a service to so beautiful a person. Their conversation was interrupted by dismal cries and groans. "What do I hear?" said Codadad. "Whence come these miserable lamentations which pierce my ears?" "My lord," said the lady to him, pointing to a little door in the court, "they come from thence. There are I know not how many wretched persons whom fate has thrown into the hands of the black. They are all chained, and the monster drew out one every day to devour." "It is an addition to my joy," answered the young prince, "to understand that my victory will save the lives of those unfortunate beings. Come along with me, madam, to partake in the satisfaction of giving them their liberty. You may judge by your own feelings how welcome we shall be to them." Having so said, they advanced towards the door of the dungeon, and the nearer they drew, the more distinctly they heard the lamentations of the prisoners. Codadad, pitying them, and impatient to put an end to their sufferings, presently put one of the keys into the lock. The noise made all the unfortunate captives, who concluded it was the black coming, according to custom, to seize one of them to devour, redoubled their cries and groans. Lamentable voices were heard, which seemed to come from the centre of the earth. In the meantime, the prince had opened the door. He went down a very steep staircase into a large and deep vault, which received some feeble light from a little window, and in which there were above 100 persons, bound to stakes, and their hands tied. "Unfortunate travellers," said he to them, "wretched victims, who only expected the moment of an approaching cruel death, give thanks to heaven, which has this day delivered you by my means. I have slain the black by whom you were to be devoured, and am come to knock off your chains." The prisoners, hearing these words, gave a shout of mingled joy and surprise. Codadad and the lady began to unbind them, and as soon as any of them were loose, they helped to take off the fetters from the rest, so that in a short time they were all at liberty. They then kneeled down, and having returned thanks to Codadad for what he had done for them, went out of the dungeon. But when they were come into the court, how was the prince surprised to see among the prisoners those he was in search of, and almost without hopes to find. "Princes," cried he, "am I not deceived? Is it you whom I behold? May I flatter myself that it may be in my power to restore you to the sultan your father, who is inconsolable for the loss of you? But will he not have some one to lament? Are you all here alive? Alas, the death of one of you will suffice to damp the joy I feel for having delivered you." The 49 princes all made themselves known to Codadad, who embraced them one after another, and told them how uneasy their father was on account of their absence. They gave their deliverer all the commendations he deserved, as did the other prisoners, who could not find words expressive enough to declare their gratitude. Codadad with them searched the whole castle, where was immense wealth, curious silks, gold brocades, Persian carpets, China satins, and an infinite quantity of other goods, which the black had taken from the caravans he had plundered, a considerable part whereof belonged to the prisoners Codadad had then liberated. Every man knew and claimed his property. The prince restored them their own, and divided the rest of the merchandise among them. Then he said to them, "How will you carry away your goods? We are here in a desert place, and there is no likelihood of your getting horses." "My lord," answered one of the prisoners, "the black robbed us of our camels as well as our goods, and perhaps they may be in the stables of this castle." "That is not unlikely," replied Codadad. "Let us examine." Accordingly they went to the stables, where they not only found the camels, but also the horses belonging to the sultan of Harran's sons. There were some black slaves in the stables, who, seeing all the prisoners released, and guessing thereby that their master had been killed, fled through byways well known to them. Nobody minded to pursue them. All the merchants, overjoyed that they had recovered their goods and camels, together with their liberty, thought of nothing but prosecuting their journey, but first repeated their thanks to their deliverer. When they were gone, Codadad, directing his discourse to the lady, said, "What place, madam, do you desire to go to? Whither were you bound when you were seized by the black? I intend to bear you company to the place you shall choose for your retreat, and I question not but that all these princes will do the same." The sultan of Harran's sons protested to the lady that they would not leave her till she was restored to her friends. "Princes," said she, "I am of a country too remote from hence, and besides that, it would be abusing your generosity to oblige you to travel so far. I must confess that I have left my native country for ever. I told you that I was a lady of Grand Cairo, but since you have shown me so much favour, and I am so highly obliged to you," added she, looking upon Codadad, "I should be much in the wrong in concealing the truth from you. I am a sultan's daughter. A usurper has possessed himself of my father's throne, after having murdered him, and I have been forced to fly to save my life." Codadad and his brothers requested the princess to tell them her story, assuring her they felt a particular interest in her misfortunes, and were determined to spare nothing that might contribute to render her more happy. After thanking them for their repeated protestations of readiness to serve her, she could not refuse to satisfy their curiosity, and began the recital of her adventures in the following manner. End of Section 8. Section 9 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 3. The History of Codadad and His Brothers, Part 2, Princess of Deryabar, Part 1. There was in a certain island a great city called Deryabar, governed by a potent, magnificent, and virtuous sultan, who had no children, which was the only blessing wanting to make him happy. He continually addressed his prayers to heaven, but heaven only partially granted his requests, for the queen his wife, after a long expectation, brought forth a daughter. I am the unfortunate princess. My father was rather grieved than pleased at my birth, but he submitted to the will of God, and caused me to be educated with all possible care, being resolved, since he had no son, to teach me the art of ruling, that I might supply his place after his death. One day, when he was taking the diversion of hunting, he espied a wild ass, which he chased, lost his company, and was carried away so far by his eagerness as to ride on till night. He then alighted, and sat down at the entrance of a wood, in which the ass had sheltered. No sooner was the day shut in than he discovered among the trees a light, which made him conclude that he was not far from some village. He rejoiced at this, hoping that he might pass the night there, and find some person to send to his followers and acquaint them where he was. Accordingly, he rose and walked towards the light, which served to guide him. He soon found he had been deceived, the light being no other than a fire blazing in a hut. However, he drew near, and with amazement beheld a black man, or rather a giant, sitting on a sofa. Before the monster was a great pitcher of wine, and he was roasting an ox he had newly killed. Sometimes he drank out of the pitcher, and sometimes cut slices off the ox, and greedily devoured them. But what most attracted my father's attention was a beautiful woman whom he saw in the hut. She seemed overwhelmed with grief. Her hands were bound, and at her feet was a little child about 2 or 3 years old, who, as if he was sensible of his mother's misfortunes, wept without ceasing, and rent the air with his cries. My father, moved with this pitiable object, thought at first to enter the hut and attack the giant, but considering how unequal the combat would be, he stopped, and resolved, since he had not strength enough to prevail by open force, to use art. In the meantime, the giant, having emptied the pitcher and devoured above half the ox, turned to the woman and said, "Beautiful princess, why do you oblige me by your obstinacy to treat you with severity? It is in your own power to be happy. You need only resolve to love and be true to me, and I shall treat you with more mildness." "Thou hideous satyr," answered the lady,
never expect that time should wear away my abhorrence of thee. Thou wilt ever be a monster in my eyes." To these words she added so many reproaches that the giant grew enraged. "This is too much," cried he in a furious tone. "My love despised is turned into rage. Your hatred has at last excited mine. I find it triumphs over my desires, and that I now wish your death more ardently than your enjoyment." Having spoken these words, he took the wretched lady by the hair, held her up with one hand in the air, and drawing his scimitar with the other, was just going to strike off her head, when the sultan my father let fly an arrow, which pierced the giant's breast, so that he staggered and dropped down dead. My father entered the hut, unbound the lady's hands, inquired who she was, and how she came thither. "My lord," said she, "there are along the sea-coast some families of Saracens who live under a prince who is my husband. This giant you have killed was one of his principal officers. The wretch fell desperately in love with me, but took care to conceal his passion till he could put in execution the design he had formed of forcing me from home. Fortune oftener favours wicked designs than virtuous resolutions. The giant one day surprised me and my child in a by-place. He seized us both, and to disappoint the search he well knew my husband would cause to be made for me, removed from the country inhabited by those Saracens, and brought us into this wood, where he has kept me some days. Deplorable as my condition is, it is still a great satisfaction to me to think that the giant, though so brutal, never used force to obtain what I always refused to his entreaties. Not but that he has 100 times threatened that he would have recourse to the worst of extremities, in case he could not otherwise prevail upon me. And I must confess to you that a while ago, when I provoked his anger by my words, I was less concerned for my life than for my honour." "This, my lord," said the Prince of the Saracens' wife, "is the faithful account of my misfortunes, and I question not but you will think me worthy of your compassion, and that you will not repent having so generously relieved me." "Madam," answered my father, "be assured your troubles have affected me, and I will do all in my power to make you happy. Tomorrow, as soon as day appears, we will quit this wood, and endeavour to fall into the road which leads to the great city of Deryabar, of which I am sovereign. And if you think fit, you shall be lodged in my palace till the prince your husband comes to claim you." The Saracen lady accepted the offer, and the next day followed the sultan my father, who found all his retinue upon the skirts of the wood, they having spent the night in searching for him, and being very uneasy because they could not find him. They were no less rejoiced to meet with than amazed to see him with a lady, whose beauty surprised them. He told them how he had found her, and the risk he had run in approaching the hut, where he must certainly have lost his life had the giant discovered him. One of his servants took up the lady behind him, and another carried the child. Thus they arrived at the palace of my father, who assigned the beautiful Saracen lady an apartment, and caused her child to be carefully educated. The lady was not insensible of the sultan's goodness to her, and expressed as much gratitude as he could desire. She had at first appeared very uneasy and impatient that her husband did not claim her, but by degrees she lost that uneasiness. The respect my father paid her dispelled her impatience, and I am of opinion she would at last have blamed fortune more for restoring her to her kindred than she did for removing her from them. In the meantime, the lady's son grew up. He was very handsome, and not wanting ability, found means to please the sultan my father, who conceived a great friendship for him. All the courtiers perceived it, and guessed that the young man might in the end be my husband. In this idea, and looking on him already as heir to the crown, they made their court to him,
and every one endeavoured to gain his favour. He soon saw into their designs, grew conceited of himself, and forgetting the distance there was between our conditions, flattered himself with the hopes that my father was fond enough of him to prefer him before all the princes in the world. He went farther, for the sultan not offering me to him as soon as he could have wished, he had the boldness to ask me of him. Whatever punishment his insolence deserved, my father was satisfied with telling him he had other thoughts in relation to me, and showed him no further resentment. The youth was incensed at this refusal. He resented the contempt, as if he had asked some maid of ordinary extraction, or as if his birth had been equal to mine. Nor did he stop here, but resolved to be revenged on the sultan, and with unparalleled ingratitude conspired against him. In short, he murdered him, and caused himself to be proclaimed sovereign of Deryabar. The first thing he did after the murder of my father was to come into my apartment at the head of a party of the conspirators. His design was either to take my life or oblige me to marry him. The Grand Vizier, however, who had been always loyal to his master, while the usurper was butchering my father, came to carry me away from the palace, and secured me in a friend's house, till a vessel he had provided was ready to sail. I then left the island, attended only by a governess and that generous minister, who chose rather to follow his master's daughter and share her misfortunes, than to submit to a tyrant. The Grand Vizier designed to carry me to the courts of the neighbouring sultans, to implore their assistance, and excite them to revenge my father's death. But heaven did not concur in a resolution we thought so just. When we had been but a few days at sea, there arose such a furious storm, that in spite of all the mariner's art, our vessel, carried away by the violence of the winds and waves, was dashed in pieces against a rock. I will not spend time in describing our shipwreck. I can but faintly represent to you how my governess, the Grand Vizier, and all that attended me, were swallowed up by the sea. The dread I was seized with did not permit me to observe all the horror of our condition. I lost my senses, and whether I was thrown upon the coast upon any part of the wreck, or whether heaven, which reserved me for other misfortunes, wrought a miracle for my deliverance, I found myself on shore when my senses returned. Misfortunes very often make us forget our duty. Instead of returning thanks to God for so singular a favour shown me, I only lifted up my eyes to heaven to complain because I had been preserved. I was so far from bewailing the vizier and my governess, that I envied their fate, and dreadful imaginations by degrees prevailing over my reason, I resolved to cast myself into the sea. I was on the point of doing so, when I heard behind me a great noise of men and horses. I looked about to see what it might be, and espied several armed horsemen, among whom was one mounted on an Arabian horse. He had on a garment embroidered with silver, a girdle set with precious stones, and a crown of gold on his head. Though his habit had not convinced me that he was chief of the company, I should have judged it by the air of grandeur which appeared in his person. He was a young man, extraordinarily well shaped, and perfectly beautiful. Surprised to see a young lady alone in that place, he sent some of his officers to ask who I was. I answered only by weeping. The shore being covered with the wreck of our ship, they concluded that I was certainly some person who had escaped from the vessel. This conjecture, and my inconsolable condition, excited the curiosity of the officers, who began to ask me 1,000 questions, with assurances that their master was a generous prince, and that I should receive protection at his court. The sultan, impatient to know who I was, grew weary of waiting the return of his officers, and drew near to me. He gazed on me very earnestly, and observing that I did not cease weeping and afflicting myself, without being able to return an answer to their questions. He forbade them troubling me any more, and directing his discourse to me, "Madam," said he, "I conjure you to moderate your excessive affliction. Though heaven in its dispensations has laid this calamity upon you, it does not behove you to despair. I beseech you show more resolution. Fortune, which has hitherto persecuted you, is inconstant, and may soon change. I dare assure you, that if your misfortunes are capable of receiving any relief, you shall find it in my dominions. My palace is at your service. You shall live with the queen my mother, who will endeavour by her kindness to ease your affliction. I know not yet who you are, but I find I already take an interest in your welfare." I thanked the young sultan for his goodness to me, accepted his obliging offers, and to convince him that I was not unworthy of them, told him my condition. I described to him the insolence of the young Saracen, and found it was enough to recount my misfortunes to excite compassion in him and all his officers who heard me. When I had done speaking, the prince began again, assuring me that he was deeply concerned at my misfortunes. He then conducted me to his palace, and presented me to the queen his mother, to whom I was obliged again to repeat my misfortunes, and to renew my tears. The queen seemed very sensible of my trouble, and conceived extreme affection for me. On the other hand, the sultan her son fell desperately in love with me, and soon offered me his person and his crown. I was so taken up with the thoughts of my calamities, that the prince, though so lovely a person, did not make so great an impression on me as he might have done at another time. However, gratitude prevailing, I did not refuse to make him happy, and our nuptials were concluded with all imaginable splendour. While the people were taken up with the celebration of their sovereign's nuptials, a neighbouring prince, his enemy, made a descent by night on the island with a great number of troops. That formidable enemy was the king of Zanguebar. He surprised and cut to pieces my husband's subjects. He was very near taking us both. We escaped very narrowly, for he had already entered the palace with some of his followers, but we found means to slip away and to get to the sea coast, where we threw ourselves into a fishing boat which we had the good fortune to meet with. 2 days we were driven about by the winds, without knowing what would become of us. The 3rd day we espied a vessel making towards us under sail. We rejoiced at first, believing it had been a merchant ship which might take us aboard. But what was our consternation when, as it drew near, we saw 10 or 12 armed pirates appear on the deck. Having boarded, 5 or 6 of them leaped into our boat, seized us, bound the prince, and conveyed us into their ship, where they immediately took off my veil. My youth and features touched them, and they all declared how much they were charmed at the sight of me. Instead of casting lots, each of them claimed the preference, and me as his right. The dispute grew warm. They came to blows, and fought like madmen. The deck was soon covered with dead bodies, and they were all killed but one, who, being left sole possessor of me, said, "You are mine. I will carry you to Grand Cairo, to deliver you to a friend of mine, to whom I have promised a beautiful slave. But who," added he, looking upon the sultan my husband, "is that man? What relation does he bear to you? Are you allied by blood or love?" "Sir," answered I, "he is my husband." "If so," replied the pirate, "in pity I must rid myself of him. It would be too great an affliction to him to see you in my friend's arms." Having spoken these words, he took up the unhappy prince who was bound, and threw him into the sea, notwithstanding all my endeavours to prevent him. I shrieked in a dreadful manner at the sight of what he had done, and had certainly cast myself headlong into the sea, but that the pirate held me. He saw my design, and therefore bound me with cords to the mainmast, then hoisting sail, made towards the land and got ashore. He unbound me and led me to a little town,
where he bought camels, tents, and slaves, and then set out for Grand Cairo, designing, as he still said, to present me to his friend according to his promise. We had been several days upon the road, when, as we were crossing this plain yesterday, we descried the black who inhabited this castle. At a distance we took him for a tower, and when near us could scarcely believe him to be a man. He drew his huge scimitar, and summoned the pirate to yield himself prisoner with all his slaves and the lady he was conducting. The pirate was daring, and being seconded by his slaves, who promised to stand by him, he attacked the black. The combat lasted a considerable time, but at length the pirate fell under his enemy's deadly blows, as did all his slaves, who chose rather to die than forsake him. The black then conducted me to the castle, whither he also brought the pirate's body, which he devoured that night. After his inhuman repast, perceiving that I ceased not weeping, he said to me, "Young lady, prepare to love me, rather than continue thus to afflict yourself. Make a virtue of necessity, and comply. I will give you till tomorrow to consider. Let me then find you comforted for all your misfortunes, and overjoyed at having been reserved for me." Having spoken these words, he conducted me to a chamber, and withdrew to his own, after locking up the castle gates. He opened them this morning, and presently locked them after him again, to pursue some travellers he perceived at a distance. But it is likely they made their escape, since he was returning alone and without any booty when you attacked him. As soon as the princess had finished the recital of her adventures, Codadad declared to her that he was deeply concerned at her misfortunes. "But, madam," added he, "it shall be your own fault if you do not live at ease for the future. The Sultan of Harran's sons offer you a safe retreat in the court of their father. Be pleased to accept of it. You will be there cherished by that sovereign and respected by all. And if you do not disdain the affection of your deliverer, permit me to assure you of it, and to espouse you before all these princes. Let them be witnesses to our contract." The princess consented, and the marriage was concluded that very day in the castle, where they found all sorts of provisions. The kitchens were full of flesh and other eatables the black used to feed on, when he was weary of feeding on human bodies. There was also a variety of fruits, excellent in their kinds, and to complete their pleasure, abundance of delicious wine and other liquors. They all sat down at table, and after having eaten and drunk plentifully, took with them the rest of the provisions, and set out for the Sultan of Harran's court. They travelled several days, encamping in the pleasantest places they could find, and were within 1 day's journey of Harran, when, having halted and drunk all their wine, being under no longer concern to make it hold out, Codadad, directing his discourse to all the company, said, "Princes, I have too long concealed from you who I am. Behold your brother Codadad. I have received my being, as well as you, from the Sultan of Harran. The Prince of Samaria brought me up, and the Princess Pirouzč is my mother. Madam," added he, addressing himself to the Princess of Deryabar, "do you also forgive me for having concealed my birth from you? Perhaps, by discovering it sooner, I might have prevented some disagreeable reflections, which may have been occasioned by a match you may have thought unequal." "No, sir," answered the princess, "the opinion I at first conceived of you heightened every moment, and you did not stand in need of the extraction you now discover to make me happy." The princes congratulated Codadad on his birth, and expressed much satisfaction at being made acquainted with it; but in reality, instead of rejoicing, their hatred of so amiable a brother was increased. They met together at night, whilst Codadad and the princess his wife lay asleep in their tent. Those ungrateful, those envious brothers, forgetting that had it not been for the brave son of Pirouzč they must have been devoured by the black, agreed among themselves to murder him. "We have no other course to choose," said one of them,
For the moment our father shall come to understand that this stranger, of whom he is already so fond, is our brother, and that he alone has been able to destroy a giant, whom we could not all of us together conquer, he will declare him his heir, to the prejudice of all his brothers, who will be obliged to obey and fall down before him." He added much more, which made such an impression on their envious and unnatural minds, that they immediately repaired to Codadad, then asleep, stabbed him repeatedly, and leaving him for dead in the arms of the Princess of Deryabar, proceeded on their journey for the city of Harran, where they arrived the next day. The Sultan their father conceived the greater joy at their return, because he had despaired of ever seeing them again. He asked what had been the occasion of their stay, but they took care not to acquaint him with it, making no mention either of the black or of Codadad, and only saying that, being curious to see different countries, they had spent some time in the neighbouring cities. In the meantime, Codadad lay in his tent weltering in his blood, and little differing from a dead man, with the princess his wife, who seemed to be in not much better condition than himself. She rent the air with her dismal shrieks, tore her hair, and bathing her husband's body with her tears, "Alas, Codadad, my dear Codadad," cried she, "is it you whom I behold just departing this life? What cruel hands have put you into this condition? Can I believe these are your brothers, who have treated you so unmercifully, those brothers whom thy valour had saved? No, they are rather devils, who under characters so dear came to murder you. O barbarous wretches! How could you make so ungrateful a return for the service he has done you? But why should I complain of your brothers, unfortunate Codadad? I alone am to blame for your death. You would join your fate with mine, and all the ill fortune that has attended me since I left my father's palace has fallen upon you. O heaven, which has condemned me to lead a life of calamities! If you will not permit me to have a consort, why did you permit me to find one? Behold, you have now robbed me of two, just as I began to be attached to them." By these and other moving expressions, the afflicted princess of Deryabar vented her sorrow, fixing her eyes on the unfortunate Codadad, who could not hear her. But he was not dead, and his consort, observing that he still breathed, ran to a large town she espied in the plain, to inquire for a surgeon. She was directed to one, who went immediately with her. But when they came to the tent, they could not find Codadad, which made them conclude he had been dragged away by some wild beast to be devoured. The princess renewed her complaints and lamentations in a most affecting manner. The surgeon was moved, and being unwilling to leave her in so distressed a condition, proposed to her to return to the town, offering her his house and service. She suffered herself to be prevailed on. The surgeon conducted her to his house, and without knowing as yet who she was, treated her with all imaginable courtesy and respect. He used all his endeavours to comfort her, but it was vain to think of removing her sorrow, which was rather heightened than diminished. "Madam," said he to her one day, "be pleased to recount to me your misfortunes. Tell me your country and your condition. Perhaps I may give you some good advice, when I am acquainted with all the circumstances of your calamity. You do nothing but afflict yourself, without considering that remedies may be found for the most desperate diseases." The surgeon's words were so efficacious that they wrought on the princess, who recounted to him all her adventures. And when she had done, the surgeon directed his discourse to her. "Madam," said he, "you ought not thus to give way to your sorrow. You ought rather to arm yourself with resolution, and perform what the name and the duty of a wife require of you. You are bound to avenge your husband. If you please, I will wait on you as your attendant. Let us go to the Sultan of Harran's court. He is a good and a just prince.
You need only represent to him in lively colours how Prince Codadad has been treated by his brothers. I am persuaded he will do you justice." "I submit to your reasons," answered the princess. "It is my duty to endeavour to avenge Codadad, and since you are so generous as to offer to attend me, I am ready to set out." No sooner had she fixed this resolution than the surgeon ordered 2 camels to be made ready, on which the princess and he mounted, and repaired to Harran. Section 10 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 3. The History of Codadad and his Brothers, Part 3. The History of the Princess of Deryabar, Part 2. They alighted at the first caravanserai they found, and inquired of the host the news at court. "It is," said he, "in very great perplexity. The sultan had a son, who lived long with him as a stranger, and none can tell what is become of the young prince. One of the sultan's wives, named Peruzd, is his mother. She has made all possible inquiry, but to no purpose. All are concerned at the loss of this prince, because he had great merit. The sultan has 49 other sons, all by different mothers, but not one of them has virtue enough to comfort him for the death of Codadad. I say his death because it is impossible he should be still alive, since no intelligence has been heard of him, notwithstanding so much search has been made." The surgeon, having heard this account from the host, concluded that the best course the Princess of Deryabar could take was to wait upon Peruzd, but that step was not without some danger, and required much precaution, for it was to be feared that if the Sultan of Harran's sons should happen to hear of the arrival of their sister-in-law and her design, they might cause her to be conveyed away before she could discover herself to Codadad's mother. The surgeon weighed all these circumstances, considered what risk he might run himself, and therefore, that he might manage matters with discretion, desired the princess to remain in the caravanserai, whilst he repaired to the palace, to observe which might be the safest way to conduct her to Peruzd. He went accordingly into the city, and was walking towards the palace, like one led only by curiosity to see the court, when he beheld a lady mounted on a mule, richly accoutred. She was followed by several ladies mounted also on mules, with a great number of guards and black slaves. All the people formed a lane to see her pass along, and saluted her by prostrating themselves on the ground. The surgeon paid her the same respect, and then asked a calender, who happened to stand by him, whether that lady was one of the sultan's wives. "Yes, brother," answered the calender, "she is, and the most honoured and beloved by the people, because she is the mother of Prince Codadad, of whom you must have heard." The surgeon asked no more questions, but followed Peruzd to a mosque, into which she went to distribute alms, and assist at the public prayers which the sultan had ordered to be offered up for the safe return of Codadad. The people, who were highly concerned for that young prince, ran in crowds to join their vows to the prayers of the priests, so that the mosque was quite full. The surgeon broke through the throng and advanced to Peruzd's guards. He waited the conclusion of the prayers, and when the princess went out, stepped up to one of her slaves, and whispered him in the ear, "Brother, I have a secret of moment to impart to the Princess Peruzd. May not I, by your means, be introduced into her apartment?" "If that secret," answered the slave, "relate to Prince Codadad, I dare promise you shall have audience of her this very day. But if it concern not him, it is needless for you to endeavour to be introduced, for her thoughts are all engrossed by her son, and she will not hear of any other subject." "It is only about that dear son," replied the surgeon, "that I wish to speak to her." "If so," said the slave, "you need only follow us to the palace, and you shall soon have the opportunity." Accordingly, as soon as Peruzd was returned to her apartment, the slave acquainted her that a person unknown
had some important information to communicate to her, and that it related to Prince Codadad. No sooner had he uttered these words than Pirouzč expressed her impatience to see the stranger. The slave immediately conducted him into the princess's closet, who ordered all her women to withdraw except 2 from whom she concealed nothing. As soon as she saw the surgeon, she asked him eagerly what news he had to tell her of Codadad. "Madam," answered the surgeon, after having prostrated himself on the ground, "I have a long account to give you, and such as will surprise you." He then related all the particulars of what had passed between Codadad and his brothers, which she listened to with eager attention. But when he came to speak of the murder, the tender mother fainted away on her sofa, as if she had herself been stabbed like her son. Her 2 women used proper means, and soon brought her to herself. The surgeon continued his relation, and when he had concluded, Pirouzč said to him, "Go back to the Princess of Deryabar, and assure her from me that the Sultan shall soon own her for his daughter-in-law. And as for yourself, be satisfied that your services shall be rewarded as liberally as they deserve." When the surgeon was gone, Pirouzč remained on the sofa in such a state of affliction as may easily be imagined, and yielding to her tenderness at the recollection of Codadad, "Oh, my son," said she, "I must never then expect to see you more. Alas! When I gave you leave to depart from Samaria, and you took leave of me, I did not imagine that so unfortunate a death awaited you at such a distance from me. Unfortunate Codadad, why did you leave me? You would not, it is true, have acquired so much renown, but you had been still alive, and not have cost your mother so many tears." While she uttered these words, she wept bitterly, and her 2 attendants, moved by her grief, mingled their tears with hers. Whilst they were all 3 in this manner vying in affliction, the sultan came into the closet, and seeing them in this condition, asked Pirouzč whether she had received any bad news concerning Codadad. "Alas, sir," said she, "all is over. My son has lost his life, and to add to my sorrow, I cannot pay him the funeral rites, for in all probability wild beasts have devoured him." She then told him all she had heard from the surgeon, and did not fail to enlarge on the inhuman manner in which Codadad had been murdered by his brothers. The sultan did not give Pirouzč time to finish her relation, but transported with anger, and giving way to his passion, "Madam," said he to the princess, "those perfidious wretches who cause you to shed these tears, and are the occasion of mortal grief to their father, shall soon feel the punishment due to their guilt." The sultan, having spoken these words, with indignation in his countenance, went directly to the presence chamber where all his courtiers attended, and such of the people as had petitions to present to him. They were alarmed to see him in passion, and thought his anger had been kindled against his people. Their hearts were chilled with fear. He ascended the throne, and causing his grand vizier to approach, "Hassan," said he, "go immediately. Take 1,000 of my guards, and seize all the princes my sons. Shut them up in the tower used as a prison for murderers, and let this be done in a moment." All who were present trembled at this extraordinary command, and the grand vizier, without uttering a word, laid his hand on his head to express his obedience, and hastened from the hall to execute his orders. In the meantime, the sultan dismissed those who attended for audience, and declared he would not hear of any business for a month to come. He was still in the hall when the vizier returned. "Are all my sons," demanded he, "in the tower?" "They are, sir," answered the vizier. "I have obeyed your orders." "This is not all," replied the sultan. "I have further commands for you." And so saying, he went out of the hall of audience, and returned to Pirouzč's apartments, the vizier following him. He asked the princess where Codadad's widow had taken up her lodging. Pirouzč's women told him, for the surgeon had not forgotten that in his relation. The sultan then turning to his minister, "Go," said he, "to this caravanserai, and conduct a young princess who lodges there, with all the respect due to her quality, to my palace." The vizier was not long in performing what he was ordered. He mounted on horseback with all the emirs and courtiers, and repaired to the caravanserai, where the princess of Deryabar was lodged, whom he acquainted with his orders, and presented her from the sultan a fine white mule, whose saddle and bridle were adorned with gold, rubies, and diamonds. She mounted and proceeded to the palace. The surgeon attended her, mounted on a beautiful Tartar horse, which the vizier had provided for him. All the people were at their windows or in the streets to see the cavalcade, and it being given out that the princess whom they conducted in such state to court was Codadad's wife, the city resounded with acclamations. The air rung with shouts of joy, which would have been turned into lamentations had that prince's fatal adventure been known, so much was he beloved by all. The princess of Deryabar found the sultan at the palace gate waiting to receive her. He took her by the hand and led her to Pirouzč's apartment, where a very moving scene took place. Codadad's wife found her affliction redouble at the sight of her husband's father and mother, as, on the other hand, those parents could not look on their son's wife without being much affected. She cast herself at the sultan's feet, and having bathed them with tears, was so overcome with grief that she was not able to speak. Pirouzč was in no better state, and the sultan, moved by these affecting objects, gave way to his own feelings and wept. All three, mingling their tears and sighs, had for some time observed a silence, equally tender and pitiful. At length the princess of Deryabar, being somewhat recovered, recounted the adventure of the castle and Codadad's disaster. Then she demanded justice for the treachery of the princes. "Yes, madam," said the sultan, "those ungrateful wretches shall perish. But Codadad's death must be first made public, that the punishment of his brothers may not cause my subjects to rebel. And though we have not my son's body, we will not omit paying him the last duties." This said, he directed his discourse to the vizier, and ordered him to cause to be erected a dome of white marble in a delightful plain, in the midst of which the city of Harran stands. Then he appointed the princess of Deryabar a suitable apartment in his palace, acknowledging her for his daughter-in-law. Hassan caused the work to be carried on with such diligence, and employed so many workmen, that the dome was soon finished. Within it was erected a tomb, which was covered with gold brocade. When all was completed, the sultan ordered prayers to be said, and appointed a day for the obsequies of his son. On that day, all the inhabitants of the city went out upon the plain to see the ceremony performed, which was after the following manner. The sultan, attended by his vizier and the principal lords of the court, proceeded towards the dome, and being come to it, he went in and sat down with them on carpets of black satin embroidered with gold flowers. A great body of horse guards, hanging their heads, drew up close about the dome, and marched round it twice, observing a profound silence. But at the third round they halted before the door, and all of them with a loud voice pronounced these words: "O Prince, son to the Sultan, could we by dint of sword and human valour repair your misfortune, we would bring you back to life. But the King of Kings has commanded, and the angel of death has obeyed." Having uttered these words, they drew off, to make way for 100 old men, all of them mounted on black mules, and having long grey beards. These were anchorites, who had lived all their days concealed in caves. They never appeared in sight of the world, but when they were to assist at the obsequies of the sultans of Harran, and of the princes of their family. Each of these venerable persons carried on his head a book, which he held with one hand. They took 3 turns round the dome without uttering a word. Then, stopping before the door,
one of them said, "O Prince, what can we do for thee? If thou couldst be restored to life by prayer or learning, we would rub our grey beards at thy feet and recite prayers. But the King of the universe has taken thee away forever." This said, the old men moved to a distance from the dome, and immediately 50 beautiful young maidens drew near to it, each of them mounted on a little white horse. They wore no veils, and carried gold baskets full of all sorts of precious stones. They also rode thrice round the dome, and halting at the same place as the others had done, the youngest of them spoke in the name of all as follows: "O Prince, one so beautiful, what relief can you expect from us? If we could restore you to life by our charms, we would become your slaves. But you are no longer sensible to beauty, and have no more occasion for us." When the young maids were withdrawn, the Sultan and his courtiers arose, and having walked thrice around the tomb, the Sultan spoke as follows: "O my dear son, light of my eyes, I have then lost thee forever." He accompanied these words with sighs, and watered the tomb with his tears, his courtiers weeping with him. The gate of the dome was then closed, and all the people returned to the city. Next day there were public prayers in all the mosques, and the same was continued for 8 days successively. On the 9th, the king resolved to cause the princes his sons to be beheaded. The people, incensed at their cruelty towards Codadad, impatiently expected to see them executed. The scaffolds were erected, but the execution was respited, because on a sudden intelligence was brought that the neighbouring princes, who had before made war on the Sultan of Harran, were advancing with more numerous forces than on the first invasion, and were then not far from the city. It had been long known that they were preparing for war, but their preparations caused no alarm. This news occasioned general consternation, and gave new cause to lament the loss of Codadad, who had signalized himself in the former war against the same enemies. "Alas!" said they, "were the brave Codadad alive, we should little regard those princes who are coming to surprise us." The Sultan, nothing dismayed, raised men with all possible speed, formed a considerable army, and, being too brave to await the enemy's coming to attack him within his walls, marched out to meet them. They, on their side, being informed by their advanced parties that the Sultan of Harran was marching to engage them, halted in the plain, and formed their army. As soon as the Sultan discovered them, he also drew up his forces, and ranged them in order of battle. The signal was given, and he attacked them with extraordinary vigour. Nor was the opposition inferior. Much blood was shed on both sides, and the victory remained long dubious. But at length it seemed to incline to the Sultan of Harran's enemies, who, being more numerous, were upon the point of surrounding him, when a great body of cavalry appeared on the plain, and approached the two armies. The sight of this fresh party daunted both sides, neither knowing what to think of them. But their doubts were soon cleared, for they fell upon the flank of the Sultan of Harran's enemies with such a furious charge that they soon broke and routed them. Nor did they stop here, they pursued them, and cut most of them in pieces. The Sultan of Harran, who had attentively observed all that passed, admired the bravery of this strange body of cavalry, whose unexpected arrival had given the victory to his army. But above all he was charmed with their chief, whom he had seen fighting with a more than ordinary valour. He longed to know the name of the generous hero. Impatient to see and thank him, he advanced towards him, but perceived he was coming to prevent him. The two princes drew near, and the Sultan of Harran, discovering Codadad in the brave warrior who had just assisted him, or rather defeated his enemies, became motionless with joy and surprise. "Father," said Codadad to him, "you have sufficient cause to be astonished at the sudden appearance before your majesty of a man whom perhaps you concluded to be dead.
I should have been so, had not heaven preserved me still to serve you against your enemies." "Oh, my son," cried the sultan, "is it possible that you are restored to me? Alas, I despaired of seeing you more." So saying, he stretched out his arms to the young prince, who flew to such a tender embrace. "I know all, my son," said the sultan again, after having long held him in his arms. "I know what return your brothers have made you for delivering them out of the hands of the black, but you shall be revenged tomorrow. Let us now go to the palace, where your mother, who has shed so many tears on your account, expects me, to rejoice with us for the defeat of our enemies. What a joy will it be to her to be informed that my victory is your work." "Sir," said Codadad, "give me leave to ask how you could know the adventure of the castle. Have any of my brothers, repenting, owned it to you?" "No," answered the sultan, "the princess of Deryabar has given us an account of everything, for she is in my palace, and came thither to demand justice against your brothers." Codadad was transported with joy to learn that the princess his wife was at the court. "Let us go, sir," cried he to his father in rapture. "Let us go to my mother, who waits for us. I am impatient to dry up her tears, as well as those of the princess of Deryabar." The sultan immediately returned to the city with his army, and re-entered his palace victorious, amidst the acclamations of the people, who followed him in crowds, praying to heaven to prolong his life, and extolling Codadad to the skies. They found Pirouzč and her daughter-in-law waiting to congratulate the sultan, but words cannot express the transports of joy they felt when they saw the young prince with them. Their embraces were mingled with tears of a very different kind from those they had before shed for him. When they had sufficiently yielded to all the emotions that the ties of blood and love inspired, they asked Codadad by what miracle he came to be still alive. He answered, that a peasant mounted on a mule, happening accidentally to come into the tent where he lay senseless, and perceiving him alone, and stabbed in several places, had made him fast on his mule, and carried him to the house, where he applied to his wounds certain herbs chewed, which recovered him. "When I found myself well," added he, "I returned thanks to the peasant, and gave him all the diamonds I had. I then made for the city of Harran, but being informed by the way that some neighbouring princes had gathered forces, and were on their march against the sultan's subjects, I made myself known to the villagers, and stirred them up to undertake his defence. I armed a great number of young men, and heading them, happened to arrive at the time when the two armies were engaged." When he had done speaking, the sultan said, "Let us return thanks to God for having preserved Codadad, but it is requisite that the traitors, who would have destroyed him, should perish." "Sir," answered the generous prince, "though they are wicked and ungrateful, consider they are your own flesh and blood. They are my brothers. I forgive their offence, and beg you to pardon them." This generosity drew tears from the sultan, who caused the people to be assembled, and declared Codadad his heir. He then ordered the princes who were prisoners to be brought out loaded with irons. Pirouzč's son struck off their chains, and embraced them all successively, with as much sincerity and affection as he had done in the court of the Black's castle. The people were charmed with Codadad's generosity, and loaded him with applause. The surgeon was next nobly rewarded in requital of the services he had done the princess of Deryabar. End of section 10. End of the history of Codadad and his brothers. Section 11 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 3. The Story of Abu Hassan, or the Sleeper Awakened, Part 1. In the reign of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, there lived at Baghdad a very rich merchant, who, having married a woman advanced in years, had but one son, whom he named Abu Hassan. and educated with great restraint. When his son was 30 years old, the merchant, dying, left him his sole heir, and master of great riches, amassed together with much frugality and close application to business. Abu Hassan, whose views and inclinations were very different from those of his father, determined to make another use of his wealth, for as his father had never allowed him any money but what was just necessary for subsistence, and he had always envied those young persons of his age who wanted for nothing, and who debarred themselves from none of those pleasures to which youth are so much addicted, he resolved in his turn to distinguish himself by extravagances proportionable to his fortune. To this end he divided his riches into 2 parts. With one half he bought houses in town and land in the country, with a resolution never to touch the income of his real estate, which was considerable enough to live upon very handsomely, but lay it all by as he received it. With the other half, which consisted of ready money, he designed to make himself amends for the time he had lost by the severe restraint in which his father had always kept him. With this intent, Abu Hassan formed a society with youths of his own age and condition, who thought of nothing but how to make their time pass agreeably. Every day he gave them splendid entertainments, at which the most delicate viands were served up, and the most exquisite wines flowed in profusion, while concerts of the best vocal and instrumental music by performers of both sexes heightened their pleasures, and this young band of debauchees, with the glasses in their hands, joined their songs with this music. These feasts were accompanied by ballets, of which the best dancers of both sexes were engaged. These entertainments, renewed every day, were so expensive to Abu Hassan that he could not support the extravagance above a year, and the great sum which he had appropriated to this prodigality and the year ended together. As soon as he had discontinued keeping this table, his friends forsook him. Whenever they saw him they avoided him, and if by chance he met any of them and went to stop them, they always excused themselves on some pretence or other. Abu Hassan was more affected by this behaviour of his friends, who had forsaken him so basely and ungratefully, after all the protestations they had made him of inviolable attachment, than by the loss of all the money he had so foolishly squandered. He went melancholy and thoughtful, his countenance expressive of deep vexation, into his mother's apartment, and sat down on the end of a sofa at a distance from her. "What is the matter with you, son?" said his mother, seeing him thus depressed. "Why are you so altered, so dejected, and so different from yourself? You could not certainly be more concerned if you had lost all you had. I know you have lived very extravagantly, and believe all your money is spent. You have still, however, a good estate, and the reason that I did not so much oppose your irregular way of living was that I knew the wise precaution you had taken to preserve half your property. I do not therefore see why you should plunge yourself into this deep melancholy." At these words Abu Hassan melted into tears, and in the midst of his sighs he exclaimed, "Ah, mother, I see at last how insupportable poverty must be. I am sensible that it deprives us of joy as the setting of the sun does of light. As poverty makes us forget all the commendations passed upon us before our fall, it makes us endeavour to conceal ourselves, and spend our nights in tears and sorrow. In short, a poor man is looked upon, both by friends and relations, as a stranger. You know, mother, how I have treated my friends for this year past. I have entertained them with all imaginable generosity, till I have spent all my money, and now they have left me, when they suppose I can treat them no longer. For my real estate, I thank heaven for having given me grace to keep the oath I made not to encroach upon that. I shall now know how to use what is left. But I will, however, try how far my friends, who deserve not that I should call them so, will carry their ingratitude. I will go to them, one after another,
and when I have represented to them what I have done on their account, ask them to make up a sum of money to relieve me, merely to try if I can find any sentiment of gratitude remaining in them." "I do not pretend, son," said Abu Hassan's mother, "to dissuade you from your design, but I can tell you beforehand that you have no ground for hope. Believe me, you will find no relief but from the estate you have reserved. I see you do not, but will soon, know these people, who, among persons of your sort, are generally called friends, and I wish to heaven you may know it in the manner I desire, for your own good." "Mother," replied Abu Hassan, "I am persuaded of the truth of what you say, but shall be more certain of a fact which concerns me so nearly, when I shall have informed myself fully of their baseness and insensibility." Abu Hassan went immediately to his friends, whom he found at home, represented to them the great need he was in, and begged of them to assist him. He promised to give bonds to pay them the money they might lend him, giving them to understand at the same time that it was in a great measure on their account that he was so distressed. That he might the more powerfully excite their generosity, he forgot not to allure them with the hopes of being once again entertained in the same manner as before. Not one of his companions was affected with the arguments which the afflicted Abu Hassan used to persuade them, and he had the mortification to find that many of them told him plainly they did not know him. He returned home full of indignation, and going into his mother's apartment, said, "Ah, madam, you were right. Instead of friends, I have found none but perfidious, ungrateful wretches, who deserve not my friendship. I renounce them, and promise you I will never see them more." He resolved to be as good as his word, and took every precaution to avoid falling again into the inconvenience which his former prodigality had occasioned, taking an oath never to give an inhabitant of Baghdad any entertainment while he lived. He drew the strong box into which he had put the rents received from his estates from the recess where he had placed it in reserve, put it in the room of that he had emptied, and resolved to take out every day no more than was sufficient to defray the expenses of a single person to sup with him, who, according to the oath he had taken, was not of Baghdad, but a stranger arrived in the city the same day, and who must take his leave of him the following morning. Conformably to this plan, Abu Hassan took care every morning to provide whatever was necessary, and towards the close of the evening went and sat at the end of Baghdad Bridge, and as soon as he saw a stranger, accosted him civilly, invited him to sup and lodge with him that night, and after having informed him of the law he had imposed upon himself, conducted him to his house. The repast with which Abu Hassan regaled his guests was not costly, but well dressed, with plenty of good wine, and generally lasted till the night was pretty far advanced. Instead of entertaining his guests with the affairs of state, his family, or business, as is too frequent, he conversed on different agreeable subjects. He was naturally of so gay and pleasant a temper that he could give the most agreeable turns to every subject, and make the most melancholy persons merry. When he sent away his guest the following morning, he always said, "God preserve you from all sorrow wherever you go. When I invited you yesterday to come and sup with me, I informed you of the law I have imposed on myself. Therefore do not take it ill if I tell you that we must never see one another again, nor drink together, either at home or anywhere else, for reasons best known to myself. So God conduct you." Abu Hassan was very exact in the observance of this oath, and never looked upon or spoke to the strangers he had once entertained. If he met them afterwards in the streets, the squares, or any public assemblies, he affected not to see them, and turned away to avoid them, that they might not speak to him, or he have any communication with them. He had acted for a long time in this manner, when, one afternoon, a little before sunset, As he sat upon the bridge according to custom, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid came by, but so disguised that it was impossible to know him. For that monarch, though his chief ministers and officers of justice acquitted themselves of their duty very punctually, would nevertheless inform himself of everything, and for that purpose often disguised himself in different ways, and walked through the city and suburbs of Baghdad, sometimes one way and sometimes another. That day, being the 1st of the month, he was dressed like a merchant of Mosul, and was followed by a tall, stout slave. As the Caliph had in his disguise a grave and respectable appearance, Abu Hassan, who thought him to be a Mosul merchant, rose up, and after having saluted him with a graceful air, said to him, "Sir, I congratulate you on your happy arrival in Baghdad. I beg you to do me the honour to sup with me, and repose yourself at my house for this night, after the fatigue of your journey." He then told him his custom of entertaining the first stranger he met with. The Caliph found something so odd and singular in Abu Hassan's whim, that he was very desirous to know the cause, and told him that he could not better merit a civility, which he did not expect as a stranger, than by accepting the obliging offer made him, that he had only to lead the way, and he was ready to follow him. Abu Hassan treated the Caliph as his equal, conducted him home, and led him into a room very neatly furnished, where he set him on a sofa in the most honourable place. Supper was ready and the cloth laid. Abu Hassan's mother, who took upon herself the care of the kitchen, sent up 3 dishes. The first contained a capon and 4 large poulets, which was set in the middle, and the second and third, placed on each side, contained one a fat roasted goose, and the other broiled pigeons. This was all, but they were good of the kind, and well flavoured, with proper sauces. Abu Hassan sat down opposite his guest, and he and the Caliph began to eat heartily of what they liked best, without speaking or drinking, according to the custom of the country. When they had done eating, the Caliph's slave brought them water to wash their hands, and in the meantime Abu Hassan's mother cleared the table, and brought up a dessert of all the various sorts of fruits then in season, as grapes, peaches, apples, pears, and various pastes of dried almonds, and so on. As soon as it grew dark, wax candles were lighted, and Abu Hassan, after requesting his mother to take care of the Caliph's slave, set out bottles and glasses. Abu Hassan, sitting down with the pretended Mosul merchant again, filled out a glass of wine before he touched the fruit, and holding it in his hand, said to the Caliph, "You know, sir, that the cock never drinks before he calls to his hens to come and drink with him. I invite you to follow my example. I do not know what you may think, but for my part, I cannot reckon him a wise man who does not love wine. Let us leave that sort of people to their dull melancholy humours, and seek for mirth, which is only to be found in a bumper." While Abu Hassan was drinking, the Caliph, taking the glass that was set for him, said, "You are an honest fellow. I like your pleasant temper, and expect you will fill me as much." Abu Hassan, as soon as he had drunk, filled the Caliph's glass, and giving it to him, "Taste this wine, sir," said he, "I will warrant it good." "I am well persuaded of that," replied the Caliph, laughing. "You know how to choose the best." "Oh," replied Abu Hassan, while the Caliph was drinking his glass, "one need only look in your face to be assured that you have seen the world, and know what good living is. If," added he in Arabic verse, "my house could think and express its joy, how happy would it be to possess you, and bowing before you would exclaim, how overjoyed am I to see myself honoured with the company of so accomplished and polite a personage, and for meeting with a man of your merit." The Caliph, naturally fond of merriment, was highly diverted with these sallies of Abu Hassan, and artfully promoted drinking, often asking for wine, thinking that when it began to operate, he might from his talkativeness satisfy his curiosity. He asked him his name, his business, and how he spent his life. "My name, sir," replied he, "is Abu Hassan. I lost my father, who was a merchant of Baghdad, and though not the richest, yet lived very comfortably. When he died, he left me money enough to live free from business. But as he always kept a very strict hand over me, I was willing, when he was gone, to make up for the time I thought I had lost. Notwithstanding this," continued Abu Hassan, "I was more prudent than most young people who give themselves up to debauchery, without any thought, pursue it till they reduce themselves to the utmost poverty, and are forced to do penance during the rest of their lives. To avoid this misfortune, I divided what I had left me into 2 parts, landed estate and ready money. I destined the ready money to supply the expenses of entertaining my acquaintance. I meditated, and took a fixed resolution not to touch my rents. I associated with young people of my own age, and with my ready money, which I spent profusely, treated them splendidly every day, and in short spared for no sort of pleasure. But this course did not last long, for by the time the year was out, I had got to the bottom of my box, and then all my table friends vanished. I made a visit to every one of them successively, and represented to them the miserable condition I was in, but none of them offered to relieve me. Upon this I renounced their friendship, and retrenched so far as to live within the compass of my income, bound myself to keep company with none but the first stranger I might meet with, coming every day into Baghdad, and to entertain him but 1 day and 1 night. I have told you the rest before, and I thank my good fortune this day for having met with a stranger of so much worth." The Caliph was well satisfied with this information, and said to Abu Hassan, "I cannot enough commend the measures you have taken, and the prudence with which you have acted, by forsaking your debauchery, a conduct rarely to be met with in young persons, and I esteem you the more for being steady to your resolution. It was a slippery path you trod in, and I cannot but admire your self-command, that, after having seen the end of your ready money, you could so far refrain as not to enter upon your rents, or even your estate. In short, I must own I envy your situation. You are the happiest man in the world, to enjoy every day the company of some one with whom you can discourse freely and agreeably, and to whom you give an opportunity to declare, wherever he goes, how handsome he was received by you. But we talk too long without drinking. Come, drink, and pour out a glass for me." In this manner the Caliph and Abu Hassan conversed together, drinking and talking of indifferent subjects, till the night was pretty far advanced, when the Caliph, pretending to be fatigued after his journey, told his host he stood in need of a little rest. "But," added he, "as I would not deprive you of yours on my account, before we part, because tomorrow I may be gone before you are stirring, I should be glad to show you how sensible I am of your civility, and the good cheer and hospitality you have shown me. The only thing that troubles me is, that I know not which way to make you any acknowledgment. I beg of you therefore to let me understand how I may do it, and you shall see I will not be ungrateful, for it is impossible but a man like you must have some business, some want, or wish for something agreeable to you. Speak freely and open your mind, for though I am but a merchant, it may be in my power to oblige you myself, or by some friend." To these offers of the Caliph, Abu Hassan, taking him still for a Mosul merchant, replied, "I am very well persuaded, sir, that it is not out of compliment that you make me these generous tenders, but upon the word of an honest man. I assure you I have nothing that troubles me, no business nor desires, and I ask nothing of anybody. I have not the least ambition, as I told you before, and am satisfied with my condition. Therefore I can only thank you for your obliging proffers, and the honour you have done me in condescending to partake of my frugal fare. Yet I must tell you," pursued Abu Hassan, "there is one thing gives me uneasiness, without however disturbing my rest. You must know the town of Baghdad is divided into quarters. in each of which there is a mosque with an imam to perform service at certain hours, at the head of the quarter which assembles there. The imam of the division I live in is a surly curmudgeon, of an austere countenance, and the greatest hypocrite in the world. 4 old men of this neighbourhood, who are people of the same stamp, meet regularly every day at this imam's house. There they vent their slander, calumny, and malice against me and the whole quarter, to the disturbance of the peace of the neighbourhood, and the promotion of dissension. Some they threaten, others they frighten, and in short would be lords paramount, and have every one govern himself according to their caprice, though they know not how to govern themselves. Indeed, I am sorry to see that they meddle with anything but their Koran, and will not let the world live quietly." "Well, I suppose," said the Caliph, "you wish to have a stop put to this disorder." "You have guessed right," answered Abu Hassan, "and the only thing I should pray for would be to be Caliph but for one day, in the stead of our sovereign lord and master Harun al-Rashid, commander of the faithful." "What would you do if you were?" asked the Caliph. "I would make examples of them," answered Abu Hassan, "to the satisfaction of all honest men. I would punish the 4 old men with each 100 bastinadoes on the soles of their feet, and the imam with 400, to teach them not to disturb and abuse their neighbours in future." The Caliph was extremely pleased with this thought of Abu Hassan's, and as he loved adventures, resolved to make this a very singular one. "Indeed," said he, "I approve much of your wish, which proceeds from an upright heart, that cannot bear the malice of such officious hypocrites. I could like to see it realized, and it is not so impossible as you may imagine. I am persuaded that the Caliph would willingly put his authority for 24 hours into your hands, if he knew your intentions, and the good use you would make of it. Though a foreign merchant, I have credit enough to contribute in some degree to the execution of this plan." "I see," said Abu Hassan, "you laugh at my foolish fancy, and the Caliph himself would laugh at my extravagance if he knew it. Yet it would be a means of informing him of the behaviour of the imam and his companions, and induce him to chastise them." "Heaven forbid," replied the Caliph, "that I, who have been so handsomely entertained by you, should laugh at you. Neither do I believe, as much a stranger as I am to you, that the Caliph would be displeased. But let us leave off talking. It is almost midnight, and time to go to bed." "With all my heart," said Abu Hassan, "I would not be any hindrance to your going to rest. But there is still some wine in the bottle, and if you please, we will drink it off first, and then retire. The only thing that I have to recommend to you is, that when you go out in the morning, if I am not up, you will not leave the door open, but give yourself the trouble of shutting it after you." This the Caliph promised to do, and while Abu Hassan was talking, took the bottle and 2 glasses, filled his own first, saying, "Here is a cup of thanks to you," and then filling the other, put into it artfully a little opiate powder, which he had about him, and giving it to Abu Hassan, said, "You have taken the pains to fill for me all night, and it is the least I can do to save you the trouble once. I beg you to take this glass. Drink it off for my sake." Abu Hassan took the glass, and to show his guest with how much pleasure he received the honour, drank it off at once, but had scarcely set the glass upon the table when the powder began to operate. He fell into so sound a sleep, and his head knocked against his knees so suddenly, that the Caliph could not help laughing. The Caliph commanded the slave he had brought with him, who entered the room as soon as he had supped, and had waited to receive orders, to take Abu Hassan upon his back and follow him, but to be sure to observe the house, that he might know it again. In this manner the Caliph, followed by the slave with his sleeping load, went out of the house,
but without shutting the door after him as he had been desired, went directly to his palace, and by a private door into his own apartment, where the officers of his chamber were in waiting, whom he ordered to undress Abu Hassan and put him into his bed, which they immediately performed. The Caliph then sent for all the officers and ladies of the palace, and said to them, "I would have all those whose business it is to attend my levee wait tomorrow morning upon the man who lies in my bed, pay the same respect to him as to myself, and obey him in whatever he may command. Let him be refused nothing that he asks, and be addressed and answered as if he were the commander of the faithful. In short, I expect that you attend to him as the true Caliph, without regarding me, and disobey him not in the least circumstance." The officers and ladies, who understood that the Caliph meant to divert himself, answered by low bows, and then withdrew, every one preparing to contribute to the best of their power to perform their respective parts adroitly. The Caliph next sent for the Grand Vizier. "Jaffier," said he, "I have sent for you to instruct you, and to prevent your being surprised tomorrow, when you come to audience, at seeing this man seated on my throne in the royal robes. Accost him with the same reverence and respect as you pay to myself. Observe and punctually execute whatever he bids you do, the same as if I commanded you. He will exercise great liberality, and commission you with the distribution of it. Do all he commands, even if his liberality should extend so far as to empty all the coffers in my treasury. And remember to acquaint all my emirs and the officers without the palace, to pay him the same honour at audience as to myself, and to carry on the matter so well that he may not perceive the least thing that may interrupt the diversion which I design myself." After the Grand Vizier had retired, the Caliph went to bed in another apartment, and gave Mesrour, the chief of his eunuchs, the orders which he was to execute, that everything should succeed as he intended, so that he might see how Abu Hassan would use the power and authority of the Caliph for the short time he had desired to have it. Above all, he charged him not to fail to awaken him at the usual hour, before he awakened Abu Hassan, because he wished to be present when he arose. Mesrour failed not to do as the Caliph had commanded, and as soon as the Caliph went into the room where Abu Hassan lay, he placed himself in a little raised closet, from whence he could see all that passed. All the officers and ladies who were to attend Abu Hassan's levee went in at the same time, and took their posts according to their rank, ready to acquit themselves of their respective duties, as if the Caliph himself had been going to rise. As it was just daybreak, and time to prepare for the morning prayer before sunrise, the officer who stood nearest to the head of the bed put a sponge steeped in vinegar to Abu Hassan's nose, who immediately turning his head about, without opening his eyes, discharged a kind of phlegm, which was received in a little golden basin before it fell on the carpet. This was the usual effect of the Caliph's powder, the sleep lasting longer or shorter in proportion to the dose. When Abu Hassan laid down his head on the bolster, he opened his eyes, and by the dawning light that appeared, found himself in a large room, magnificently furnished, the ceiling of which was finely painted in arabesque, adorned with vases of gold and silver, and the floor covered with a rich silk tapestry. He saw himself surrounded by many young and handsome ladies, many of them having instruments of music in their hands, and black eunuchs, richly clothed, all standing with great modesty and respect. After casting his eyes on the covering of the bed, he perceived it was cloth of gold, richly embossed with pearl and diamonds, and near the bed lay, on a cushion, a habit of tissue, embroidered with jewels, with a caliph's turban. At the sight of these glittering objects, Abu Hassan was in the most inexpressible amazement, and looked upon all he saw as a dream, yet a dream he wished it not to be. "So," said he to himself, "I am Caliph.
But," added he, recollecting himself, "it is only a dream, the effect of the wish I entertained my guest with last night." And then he turned himself about and shut his eyes to sleep. At the same time the eunuch said very respectfully, "Commander of the faithful, it is time for your majesty to rise to prayers. The morning begins to advance." These words very much surprised Abu Hassan. "Am I awake, or do I sleep?" said he to himself. "Ah, certainly I am asleep," continued he, keeping his eyes shut. "There is no reason to doubt of it." Immediately the eunuch, who saw he had no inclination to get up, said again, "Your majesty must permit me to repeat once more that it is time to rise to morning prayer, unless you choose to let it pass. The sun is just rising, and you never neglect this duty." "I am mistaken," said Abu Hassan immediately. "I am not asleep, but awake. For those who sleep do not hear, and I hear somebody speak to me." Then, opening his eyes again, he saw plainly by broad daylight what he had seen but indistinctly before, and starting up, with a smiling countenance, like a man overjoyed at sudden promotion. The caliph, from his recess, penetrated his thoughts with great delight. The young ladies of the palace now prostrated themselves with their faces to the ground before Abu Hassan, and those who had instruments of music in their hands wished him a good morrow by a concert of soft flutes, hautboys, theorbos, and other harmonious instruments, with which he was enchanted, and in such an ecstasy that he knew not whether he was himself. But reverting to his first idea, he still doubted whether what he saw and heard was a dream or a reality. He clapped his hands before his eyes, and, lowering his head, said to himself, "What means all this? Where am I? And to whom does this palace belong? What can these eunuchs, handsome well-dressed officers, beautiful ladies, and musicians mean? How is it possible for me to distinguish whether I am in my right senses or in a dream?" When he took his hands from his eyes, opened them, and lifted up his head, the sun shone full in at the chamber window, and at that instant Mesrour, the chief of the eunuchs, came in, prostrated himself before Abu Hassan, and said, "Commander of the faithful, your majesty will excuse me for representing to you that you used not to rise so late, and that the time of prayer is over. If your majesty has not had a bad night, it is time to ascend your throne and hold a council as usual. All your generals, governors, and other great officers of state wait your presence in the council hall." End of section 11.